I was watching the classic Japanese film The Ballad of Narayama recently, and there's a specific scene that is almost physically painful to endure. An old woman, healthy and strong, picks up a jagged stone and deliberately smashes out her own front teeth. She isn't acting out of madness, she does it out of love. In her village, custom dictates that once you turn 70, you must be carried up the mountain and left to die so the young have enough food to survive. By brutally disfiguring herself, she makes herself appear older and frailer, giving her son the visual permission he needs to abandon her in the snow without hesitation. To the characters in the film, this isn't murder. It is a pious, necessary duty. It paints a chilling picture of a world where survival just overrides humanity. But what struck me as I watched wasn't just the horror of the fiction, it was the realization that for thousands of years across the vast steppes of Eurasia, this logic of the wild was actually the standard operating procedure. The rule was simple: value the strong, despise the weak. But then history takes a fascinating, dangerous turn. Approximately 3,000 years ago, one civilization in the Central Plains decided to flip this logic entirely on its head. They stopped sacrificing the weak to the gods and started worshiping the elderly instead. It sounds like a noble moral evolution, but in reality, it was a declaration of war against the natural order. This shift didn't bring them peace. It painted a massive target on their backs, sparking a centuries-long siege where civilization was constantly one sword strike away from being wiped out by the wild. And nothing captures that desperate, lonely stand quite like the frozen ruins archaeologists stumbled upon in 2013, a lost castle in the desert where a handful of men decided to hold the line against an entire world that wanted them dead.
That narrative, it provides such a potent contrast for our deep dive today. What we're really setting out to do is analyze that precise moment of radical moral transformation. We're going to examine how that move from the harsh, survivalist logic that prioritized the strong to an ethical structure prioritizing elders and moral duty, how that didn't just become a philosophy. It became the very core of Chinese civilization, which then had to be desperately and strategically defended for millennia.
I think the most compelling idea here is that this moral choice wasn't just some soft philosophical evolution. It was a hard infrastructural pivot that determined military and political strategy for centuries.
Exactly. If you decide to keep your liabilities, you're aged, you're weak in decision, you have to pay for that decision with constant vigilance.
So where do we start?
Well, we can trace this civilizational story across three massive overlapping phases. We start with the moral revolution itself. Their radical foundational transition from the horrific era of institutionalized human sacrifice in the Shang Dynasty to the establishment of a social contract based on Xiao, or filial piety, under the succeeding Zhou Dynasty. That moral choice is what provides the initial target.
And then the focus shifts from the philosophical to the geopolitical, I imagine.
It does. The second phase really examines the sheer military and diplomatic resilience required to defend this incredibly costly moral choice. This was an ongoing 2,000-year struggle against the persistent threat of nomadic groups who engaged in what scholars call strategic blackmail on the northern frontier.
Okay, so we're talking about the actual mechanisms of survival, not just the idea, but how you protect it.
Precisely. And finally, we'll explore how this unique ethical foundation, this commitment to valuing accumulated wisdom and ritual propriety over mere brute strength shaped China's enduring identity as the Tianqiao, or the Celestial Empire. And this identity, in turn, profoundly influenced its governance models and established its cultural centrality across the whole of East Asia. It defined the Sinosphere.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then, in the deepest darkness of the Shang Dynasty. When we talk about human sacrifice being institutionalized, what does that truly mean? Because we aren't talking about isolated, ancient ritual practices here. This sounds like it was baked into the government's daily function.
It was absolutely central, right down to the state archives. The Shang Dynasty, ruling roughly from the 17th to the 11th century BCE, normalized violence to a staggering degree. It was intertwined with their religious practices, their political legitimacy, and, their internal cohesion.
So the evidence we have must be pretty visceral.
Oh, it is. Archaeological sites, most famously at the capital Yingsu and nearby cemeteries like Lujiasuang, reveal a scale of brutality that even modern historians for a long time struggle to fully accept. They struggled until the sheer volume of evidence just made it undeniable.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Take the sacrificial pits at Yingsu. These weren't just mass graves. They were carefully structured altars. We find evidence of decapitated bodies, often buried in layers, sometimes with their torsos oriented precisely to appease certain ancestors or deities. It speaks to a standardized, repetitive process of ritual killing.
And there was that truly shocking finding concerning the bronze vessels, which were, these were the height of Shang technological and artistic achievement.
The discoveries are just chillingly pragmatic in their cruelty. Researchers found human skulls contained within Yan bronze cooking vessels.
A cooking vessel?
Yes, a Yan vessel was not a ceremonial skull cup or anything like that. It was an everyday, high-status steamer or cooking pot used for preparing food for feasts and rituals. So to find a human head inside one of these, it suggests an utter normalization of the act. The victim was being processed as a resource.
I recall the specific tomb found at Lujiazhuang in 1999 that seems to detail the process perfectly.
Yes. That particular tomb contained the headless skeleton of a young girl, and right where her skull should have been was an inverted bronze Yan. When researchers opened the vessel, they found her skull inside.
Wow.
And the key detail, which the archaeologists noted, was the grayish-green discoloration and the decomposition pattern on the bone. It led them to conclude the skull had been steamed.
Steamed? You mean literally cooked?
Literally. This wasn't battlefield savagery. This was calculated, high-status ritual execution and preparation. It suggests the state held absolute bureaucratic control over the lives and deaths of its people.
That degree of control must have been fueled by a profound sense of religious fear. Why did the Shang require this constant throughput of human life?
Their worldview was deeply pessimistic, and it was defined by terror. They believed the cosmos was populated by temperamental, immensely powerful ancestral spirits and nature gods who were perpetually insatiable. They demanded constant replenishment of life force, often human life, to grant blessings like good harvests or military success.
So it was a contractual, fear-based relationship.
Exactly. The state's role was to mediate this terror through sacrifice.
And the very language they used, I understand, reinforced this culture of violence.
Precisely. We can see in the divination records the oracle bone script used during this era. While these records tracked everything from, dental pain to crop yields, two of the most frequently recurring glyphs translated directly to conquest and killing. Violence wasn't an aberration. It was an intrinsic part of their political and cosmological reality.
But it also seems like it was a crucial tool for consolidating the Shang identity, for distinguishing themselves from everyone else.
Absolutely. This brutality served a profound political function, especially in regime preservation and social cohesion. The victims were often outsiders, people they designated as enemies or inferiors.
Like the Kuang people.
Specifically, they targeted the Kuang people, who were frequently classified as barbarians or prisoners of war. Scholars estimate the human sacrifice was so systematized that over half of all recorded human victims found in the inscriptions were identified as Huang. By ritually slaughtering them, the Shang rulers drew a bloody line, forging a common identity for us, the superior insider, and justifying their power to mediate life and death.
So if that was the normalized state of affairs, institutionalized violence, profound religious terror, and using sacrifice to define identity, how did the succeeding Zhou Dynasty manage to pivot away from that? It sounds like it happened in a single radical generation. It seems like attempting to turn off the sun.
It was a conscious, audacious political and moral break. The transition point is framed by the end of the Shang era, personified by the defeated Shang king Dishin. He culminates the old order by ascending the massive Deer Terrace Pavilion, covering himself in precious ritual jades and setting himself on fire as a final, spectacular sacrifice to heaven.
So he died through the very mechanism, institutionalized sacrifice that defined his rule.
Precisely. And the Zhou, the new conquerors, had a massive ideological problem. They needed to legitimize their rule, their mandate of heaven, without relying on the terror and, well, the blood magic that defined the Shang.
That's the key challenge, isn't it?
It is. The Zhou leaders, especially the revered Duke of Zhou, understood that they needed a foundational moral system that was sustainable and fundamentally different from the capricious cruelty of the Shang gods. So they executed a moral revolution by consciously shifting the religious focus away from appeasing volatile external deities demanding human life and toward ancestor worship.
That's a huge shift. Instead of trying to pay off some distant, unknowable god with a steamed head, they focused on their own lineage, the people they knew.
Exactly. They actively banned human sacrifice. And they did something even more successful. They sought to erase the cultural memory of it so effectively that for nearly 3,000 years, Chinese scholars debated whether Shang accounts of sacrifice were exaggerated, only to have archaeology confirm the brutality centuries later. The focus moved from fear of the gods to obligation to one's own kin.
And this obligation is codified in Xiao, or filial piety. How does this concept translate practically into a social contract that governs millions of people?
Xiao became the absolute bedrock of the new Zhou social order. If the Shang demanded that the strong and young sacrifice the weak to the ghosts, the Zhou system decreed the opposite. The strong and young had an eternal foundational debt of love, respect, material support, and deference to their parents and elders. This is far more than a nice idea. It was an infrastructural change to the entire civilization.
So this must have profoundly altered the economic and agricultural decision-making of the entire society.
It completely reversed the logic of survival. Think again of the village in the Ballad of Narayama. The old woman was a liability during a lean winter, an extra mouth to feed. The Zhou system transformed her into the civilization's most valuable, indispensable resource, a living library of survival.
A living library. I like that. How did that work in practice?
Well, consider a settled agricultural society that relies entirely on complex accumulated knowledge, when to plant, when to harvest, irrigation techniques, which fungi are poisonous, which fields retain water best, and most crucially, accurate weather prediction based on decades of observation. That knowledge doesn't reside in books or code. It resides in the heads of the people who have seen 50 or 60 cycles of the seasons.
So to abandon your elderly was to literally erase critical, irreplaceable data points necessary for the survival of the next generation.
Exactly. The mandate to support them wasn't sentimental. It was pragmatic survival strategy. The economic cost of supporting the elderly was offset by the value of the knowledge they retained.
And the Chinese character for Xiao itself seems to capture this.
It really does, visually. The character for Xiao combines the character for old, Lao, sitting on top of the character for son. Here was a graphical representation of the contract. The older generation, representing wisdom and accumulated knowledge, is supported, literally carried, by the younger generation, which provides the necessary strength and labor.
And this family value didn't stay confined to the household. Confucius later used this as the foundation for state governance.
That's where it scaled up to a civilizational identity. Confucius, centuries later, formalized this in texts like the Xiao Jing, the classic of filial piety. His argument was elegantly simple. If a man learned obedience, respect, and duty within his family, honoring his parents and elders, that respect was the perfect training ground for good citizenship.
So respect just flowed outward.
It created a hierarchy of duty. Respect for parents extended naturally to teachers, then to superiors in the bureaucracy, and finally, culminating in unwavering service and loyalty to the country and its leader.
The family unit was the micro-model for the state, and Zhao was the cultural glue that ensured stability and predictability across vast geographic distances. It's what allowed for centralized bureaucratic rule.
This shift from the brutal logic of the wild that valued only brute strength to honoring ancestral teachings and revering elders seems to have immediately defined the identity of the Central Plains.
It established the fundamental cultural fault line between Huaxia civilization and the surrounding world. This conscious moral choice stood in stark, almost aggressive opposition to surrounding tribal values, many of which still practiced genocide or ruthlessly favored only the strong warriors. This moral evolution did something critical. It generated a profound and enduring sense of cultural and therefore political superiority.
They weren't just richer or better armed. In their own minds, they were ethically superior.
That's the whole ballgame. And that ethic provided the legitimacy for the expansion of Central Plains civilization and established the crucial boundary between the civilized Huaxia and the surrounding peoples.
Okay, so it sounds like that moral foundation was brilliant, but it immediately painted a target on their backs. If valuing the old meant they couldn't just be mobile raiders, how did they protect that very expensive social contract on the frontier? That brings us to the next phase, the constant siege and the pragmatic defense of this ethical choice.
It was an immense undertaking. For the next 2 millennia, settled agricultural civilizations in the Central Plains had to grapple with a persistent existential military threat from highly mobile, often centralized nomadic empires. You're talking about the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Mongols, all along that vast northern frontier. Maintaining a society that prioritized long-term wisdom, settled agriculture, and complex bureaucracy required an expenditure of statecraft and military strength that few other ancient empires could match for sheer duration.
We often hear about raids and invasions, but the conflict wasn't just random acts of violence, was it? There was a high-level strategy behind the nomadic pressure.
Absolutely. Scholars conceptualize this long-term conflict as an exercise in strategic blackmail or the outer frontier strategy. The nomadic groups were highly organized, especially after large federations like the Xiongnu formed. They used their unparalleled military advantage, their lightning-fast cavalry and superior mobility as a calculated diplomatic lever.
So it's essentially using the threat of destruction as a means of enforcing trade.
That's the most accurate way to frame it. The nomadic economy, relying on livestock and seasonal migration, was often resource scarce. They lacked things like high-quality iron tools, silk, grain surpluses, bureaucratic expertise. The agricultural South, China, had all of these. So the nomadic strategy was to apply military pressure, large destructive raids, not necessarily to occupy the land long-term, but to enforce a parasitic, unequal trade relationship, to extract necessary resources in the form of payments, gifts, or subsidized commerce.
So China's statecraft had to be a blend of military containment and some kind of sophisticated management of this asymmetrical power dynamic.
It required incredible flexibility. Statecraft was historically obsessed with three strategies: constructing passive defenses like the Great Wall system, executing active offense, which meant military campaigns deep into the steppes, and crucially, employing pragmatic diplomacy when military defeat was unaffordable or just impossible.
Let's focus on that pragmatic diplomacy because the Heian alliances seem to embody the difficult compromise required to maintain that expensive moral order.
Heian, literally meaning peace marriage, was the practice of institutionalizing political relationships by marrying a Chinese princess to the ruler, or Chanyu, of a powerful rival state. It was a strategy of appeasement, really, employed when the Central Plains state was too weak, exhausted, or just preoccupied with internal problems to defeat a major enemy outright.
And this practice carried a profound internal diplomatic risk, didn't it? It implied a degree of equality between the emperor and the nomadic ruler.
It was highly controversial, precisely for that reason. It undercut the core Chinese self-perception of being the Zonghua, or Central Kingdom. This policy was most famously implemented during the Han Dynasty, specifically after the humiliating defeat at the Battle of Beiding in 200 BC, where Emperor Gaozu was nearly captured by the Xiongnu. The subsequent Heian agreements involved a treaty where China promised huge annual gifts of silk, liquor, and grain, plus a Han princess for marriage.
And to protect imperial dignity, they often didn't send real princesses, right?
Right, the deception became necessary. To avoid sending the emperor's actual daughters, which would acknowledge near equal status, Han officials frequently substituted unrelated commoner women or distant relatives from minor branches of the ruling family. They just falsely labeled them princesses. And these women, they became powerful cultural bridges living in the nomadic courts, often raising the next generation of Jianyu.
It's fascinating how these diplomatic and, often sad personal alliances created real cross-cultural connections despite the political animosity.
They absolutely did. Think of figures like the Han general Li Ling, who was captured by the Xiongnu and eventually defected, marrying a daughter of the Xiongnu. Or Zheng Hian, the famous explorer, who also spent time among the nomadic groups. These individuals and their marriages formed kinship ties that extended into the nomadic elite, sometimes providing intelligence, sometimes influencing policy, and always functioning as conduits for Chinese culture and statecraft into the steppe.
And the policy evolved dramatically, which demonstrates that it wasn't just a sign of weakness, but a tool of flexible statecraft, especially under the Qing Dynasty, centuries later.
The Manchu-led Qing Dynasty from 1644 to 1912 offers a brilliant example of adapting the Heian principle. For the king, this was not primarily about appeasement against a military threat, but about political consolidation. They extensively married Manchu princesses into powerful ethnic Mongol princely houses. We know that over 58% of all grooms in the early Qing Dynasty who married into the ruling Manchu line were ethnic Mongols. This was a strategic political move to gain critical military support, secure the loyalty of the vast Mongolian plateau, and integrate disparate ethnic groups into their new imperial structure.
So diplomacy bought them time, but ultimately, the civilizational consensus had to be defended physically when the diplomatic tools ran out. That brings us to that crucial, desperate stand at Xiao Castle.
This specific incident, the defense led by General Gengang between 75 and 76 AD, is one of the most powerful symbols of the Han state's enduring resolve. It really encapsulates the immense human cost of defending that ethical choice.
Okay, let's paint the picture. Where exactly was this castle, and what made the siege so desperate?
Xiao Castle was located deep in the western regions, in what is now Qitai County in Xinjiang, near the Tian Shan Mountains. Gengang commanded a tiny Han garrison, estimated to be only about 200 soldiers, guarding a critical outpost. In 75 AD, the Han lost control of the western region capital, meaning Genggong was completely isolated, facing overwhelming numbers of the northern Xiongnu cavalry. The siege was designed for total annihilation. The Xiongnu simply cut off the Shul River, the castle's only water source.
A siege weaponized by thirst and isolation. That's brutal.
The desperation was total. The soldiers endured appalling conditions for 9 months. The historical record details that they became so dehydrated and starved that they resorted to boiling and consuming every piece of leather in the fort armor, saddles, crossbow strings made of raw cowhide, just to get calories and moisture. Worse, they were reduced to squeezing the fluid from horse dung to drink.
That's unbelievable. This wasn't merely hardship. It was biological collapse. The odds of rescue must have been zero.
They certainly appeared that way. But this leads to the moment of psychological warfare that broke the siege. Genggong, seeing his men failing, looked up and sighed, recalling a famous historical precedent, the legend of General Li Guangli, who struck a mountain and water flowed. Genggong, in a moment of inspired leadership, dressed in his full officer uniform and prayed at a well they were already digging. He ordered the soldiers to dig one more time.
And they struck water.
They did. It was either a stroke of incredible luck or the result of Genggong's psychological brilliance rallying his troops to dig deeper than they thought possible. But the effect was immediate and profound. The soldiers were so overjoyed that they splashed the water over the walls, making it visible to the besieging Xiongnu.
So the Xiongnu saw this sudden appearance of water and immediately thought the Han had divine intervention on their side.
Exactly. The psychological impact was devastating to the besiegers. They believed the Han army possessed divine power that literally conjured water in the desert. This momentarily broke the Xiongnu's siege mentality, confusing them and buying Genggong crucial time.
Meanwhile, back at the court, this tiny, desperate garrison was the subject of a massive internal political debate. They were ready to abandon them.
They were. Emperor Ming had recently died, and the court was debating the cost-benefit analysis. The consensus among the highest court officials was overwhelming. Shul was over 1,000 kilometers away, crossing the brutal Gobi Desert and the freezing Tian Shan Mountains. The logistics of sending a large force were nearly insurmountable, and the cost was deemed too high for just 200 men. They argued for abandonment.
But someone convinced the new emperor that the cost of not rescuing them was far greater than the cost of the rescue itself.
Grand Administrator Bao Yu made the decisive civilizational argument. His logic transcended military calculus. He argued that abandoning soldiers who had risked their lives so far from the central kingdom would not only embolden external enemies, who would see China as weak and unreliable, but critically, it would internally crush the morale and loyalty of every soldier in the Han Empire.
He recognized that the ultimate strategic resource was the faith of the people in the system.
That's the key takeaway. Bao Yu argued that the Han moral system, the very commitment to duty and loyalty inherited from the Zhou, was worthless if the state wouldn't uphold its end of the contract. They had to rescue the defenders, regardless of the cost, to maintain the fundamental stability and loyalty of the empire.
A rescue force of 7,000 was dispatched, which in itself must have been a logistical nightmare.
It was a brutal campaign. The logistics faltered, and they were forced to abandon provisions in heavy snows crossing the mountains. When the rescue force finally reached the ruins of Shul, only 26 people remained alive in the castle. The Xiongnu pursued them relentlessly for 3 months during the grueling return journey. When they finally crossed back into the central kingdom at Yumen Pass, only 13 of Genggong's original 200 soldiers returned alive, including Genggong and Fan Qing.
The human sacrifice was immense, but the victory was purely symbolic and strategic.
It was a defining moment of resolve. The historian Fania, writing later in the Book of the Later Han, immortalized this stand. He praised Genggong for facing a situation where death was certain and survival impossible, proving that the strength of the Han lay not in its metal or its crossbows, but in its shared civilizational consensus to never yield to barbarism. This endurance, fueled by the core values of loyalty and duty inherited from the moral revolution, proved to be their ultimate enduring asset.
When you compare that desperate endurance to other celebrated ancient military feats, like Xenophon's famous retreat with the Greek mercenaries, the scale of Genggong's stand seems even more profound.
Some historians note that the Greek retreat, while geographically massive, involved largely skirmishes with disunited tribes under relatively mild climate conditions. Ganggong's defense was a 9-month high-intensity siege against the highly organized elite cavalry of the Xiongnu, fought in brutal desert and winter terrain. The resolve required to withstand that, driven by a non-military philosophical commitment to the state, speaks volumes about the unique moral strength forged by Han's statecraft.
That successful, albeit devastating defense of the Central Plains values must have absolutely solidified how the Central Kingdom viewed itself, leading us to Phase 3. The architecture of superiority.
Absolutely. Because they had made that foundational ethical commitment to Xiao, to ancestor worship, and to valuing the wisdom and social contract that allowed agriculture to flourish, and because they had defended it at that immense existential cost, the Central Plains civilization perceived itself as the uniquely, legitimately civilized core of the known world.
And this is where the term Celestial Empire, Tian Xiao, becomes more than just a grand title.
It becomes the foundation of their identity and international relations. Tianjian literally means heavenly dynasty. Its conceptual origin rests on the belief that the emperor was the son of heaven, Tianzi. By extension, the land he ruled, China, was the Central Kingdom, Zhongguo, the only true civilization ordained by the cosmos.
This sounds less like a country and more like a cosmological mandate.
It was a worldview that established the concept of Tianxia, meaning everything under the sky. This led to the Central Kingdom complex, a self-perception that divided the world into two non-negotiable categories: the civilized core, Huaxia, and everyone else, the non-civilized or barbarians, Yu. For the emperors, the world wasn't a collection of equal states, it was a hierarchy culminating in the Son of Heaven.
I find the soft power aspect of this superiority so compelling. It wasn't just about military might. The philosophical commitment commanded respect.
It did. The stability and order derived from the Confucian principles, rooted in Xiao, were hugely attractive to neighboring states whose internal systems might have been more volatile or reliant solely on military strongmen. There's a wonderful anecdote, often recounted, about a rugged envoy from a neighboring tribal state visiting the imperial court during a period of great stability. He expects to witness displays of armed power, as that defines strength in his culture.
And what did he see instead?
He witnessed a high-ranking general, a commander responsible for thousands of troops, and the defense of the realm bow deeply and respectfully to a hunched, white-haired scholar holding nothing but a stack of scrolls and a brush. The general stood aside, waiting for the old scholar to pass, showing deference to age and learning.
So the envoy realized that the ultimate authority in this land wasn't brute force, but moral authority and age.
Exactly. It was an epiphany about the power structure. The cultural message was profound. This empire's stability, wealth, and power weren't just based on conquest. They were rooted in lie, or propriety, ritual, and respect for the hierarchy. The envoy supposedly left not just with trade goods, but with a powerful desire to implement that social stability, that moral structure, back in his homeland.
So this cultural superiority, rooted in ethics, helped facilitate the widespread and positive transmission of Chinese governance models.
Absolutely. And this cultural confidence manifested directly into a formal geopolitical system that structured relations across East Asia, the tributary system.
Right.
The Sino-centric tributary system was the operational framework for international relations. Neighboring states, including kingdoms in Korea, Vietnam, the Ryukyu Islands, and often groups in Southeast Asia and Japan, were considered vassals obliged to offer tribute to the Chinese emperor at specific intervals.
From the outside, it looks like a mechanism designed for China's economic gain. Was that its primary function?
That's a common misconception. While political submission was non-negotiable, the system often functioned more as a form of highly subsidized diplomatic engagement that significantly benefited the tributary states. The emperor provided return bestowals, or huisi, which were lavish gifts of silk, gold, silver, books, and ritual objects. These return goods were frequently far more economically valuable to the tributary states than the nominal tribute they offered.
So it was less about immediate revenue and more about maintaining stability and affirming hierarchical status.
Precisely. It was a projection of benevolence and hierarchy, securing the stability of the periphery. For instance, trade, such as the Kongo-Tally trade with Japan during the Ming Dynasty, was strictly conditional on this political submission and appearance at court. The system ensured peace and facilitated the massive cultural transmission of Chinese models, Confucianism, Mahayana Buddhism, advanced bureaucratic administration, and Chinese literary culture across the Sinosphere, helping these peripheral states build more stable, centralized societies.
And this projection of power wasn't purely abstract. The Ming Dynasty took this projection onto the seas.
That's right. The voyages of Admiral Zheng He in the 15th century are the ultimate physical affirmation of Central Kingdom dominance. His massive treasure fleets sailed as far as East Africa, not primarily for conquest, but to exact tribute, register new vassal states, and grant spectacularly lavish gifts to foreign rulers. These voyages affirmed the Tianxia worldview over the maritime world, establishing China's dominance and attracting more entities into its sphere of influence.
This robust and self-confident worldview of the Tianxia must have felt eternal. But nothing is immune to changing global dynamics. The ultimate challenge came with the arrival of Western powers in the 19th century.
That period marks the absolute unraveling of the traditional worldview. The Tianxia system was based on the premise that China was the only true civilization. When industrializing Western powers, who fundamentally rejected the hierarchical tributary framework, arrived with superior military technology and demanded equal diplomatic status, it was an existential shock.
The military defeats in conflicts like the Opium Wars weren't just losses of territory. They forced a systemic reevaluation of Chinese self-identity.
Correct. The Opium Wars in the 1840s and again in the 1850s forced the Qing dynasty to acknowledge its weakened status relative to global powers for the first time in millennia. Chinese scholars, statesmen, and political leaders were forced to confront a world where military and technological might, not moral superiority rooted in Xiao, defined international influence. This triggered an intense intellectual and political movement to redefine Chinese nationalism.
That intellectual search for how to survive in this new world led directly to the self-strengthening movement.
Launched in the 1860s by influential figures like Zhang Zhidong, Prince Gong, and Li Hongzhang, the self-strengthening movement was a conscious, pragmatic effort to redefine the Celestial Empire not just through philosophy, but through industrial and military strength. They sought to adopt Western technology and knowledge to restore national sovereignty and power.
Their guiding principle seems to have been purely pragmatic survival.
The slogans capture that urgency perfectly. Self-strengthening, seek wealth, and the brutally honest maxim, learn advanced technology from the barbarians to defeat the barbarians. It was a recognition that moral authority alone could not stop a steamship or a Maxim gun. They needed modernization in factories, arsenals, and schools. They sent students abroad to study Western science and industry.
And one of the most fascinating aspects of this modernization was the realization that physical strength was a national asset that needed to be cultivated, leading to the focus on national fitness.
That transformation from prioritizing intellectual and philosophical superiority derived from Xiao to stressing physical strength was crucial for the transition to modern statehood. Leaders hired foreign military officers and integrated Western physical training techniques, notably systems influenced by Swedish and German gymnastics, into the newly formed modernized armies like the Shang Army and the Hui Army.
And this was clearly framed as a nationalistic necessity, not just a way to improve military drilling.
It was explicitly aimed at the populace. Zhang Zhidong, a key figure in the movement, made this connection clear, declaring that physical training concerned the future of the country. He stated, "If everyone is as strong as soldiers, China will be a powerful country." The promotion of physical strength among all civilians was seen as vital for creating a robust national identity, capable of standing up to foreign dominance, proving that the commitment to civilizational endurance, first forged in the Moral Revolution, now required a new, modern form of physical expression.
This journey has shown us that what appears to be a gentle ethical concept reverence for the elderly was, in fact, a radical and very expensive choice. It was a rejection of the natural order that dictated survival of the fittest.
It's a remarkable trajectory. The conscious, radical moral choice made by the Zhou to value wisdom and life over brute strength created a unique civilizational identity. The tenacious, centuries-long defense of that identity, culminating in desperate stands like Shul Castle and sophisticated diplomatic maneuvers like Haken, proved that this philosophical commitment was its most powerful strategic resource for stability, continuity, and enduring statehood. The unique architecture of the Central Kingdom was fundamentally rooted in the reverence for the elderly, which allowed it to become the enduring center of the sinosphere.